because this is such a huge topic, I'm just going to dive straight into what the Second International was. So the Second International was a body representing the mass socialist parties that had grown at the start of the 20th century. So think about Copenhagen 1910 Congress. There were 887 delegates, 189 German, 84 from Britain, 78 from France, 38 from Russia. And I kind of wanted to put these numbers in because one of the lessons, and I think it's helpful in the face of, the craziness of this Trump result, is just how quickly history can change. And those parties, I'm not going to rush ahead, but those numbers changed very, very much in the face of the First World War. But yeah, the Second International, these parties represented millions of socialists, people vote, millions and millions of voters, trade union representatives, etc. The International was led by the German Social Democratic Party, the SPD, that had 1 million members. And to think about this, this is quite astounding. They had more than 90 daily newspapers, as well as weekly periodicals and journals. And they were the single largest party in the German parliament, although there were many parties in the German parliament. The party permeated every aspect of working class life with youth organisations, socialist schools, sports clubs, cooperatives and trade unions, SPD trade unions, which organised millions. The Second International and the SPD that led it were understood to be the descendants of Marx. And the International included the Bolsheviks, it included Trotsky, Luxemburg, all of the key revolutionary figures who we look to. But its key theoretician of the Second International was Kautsky, who was known as the Pope of Marxism. So in the 1900s, it became quite clear that the world was moving towards a war in Europe. And in 1910, the Copenhagen Congress I mentioned resolved that in the event of war, it would create, the International would create immediate worldwide strike to stop the war. Similarly, in 1907 and in 1912, they passed a resolution saying that they would exert every effort to prevent war, utilise the economic and political crisis created by the war to rouse the masses and thereby hasten the downfall of capitalist rule. Now, this last passage was fought for by Lenin and Luxemburg, but nevertheless, it was the official stance of the Second International. As Europe stumbled into war in 1914, initially the parties of the International continued to denounce the war. The British Social Democrats organised mass rallies, as did the French. And in Germany, the SPD's main paper wrote on the 25th of July that not a drop of German soldiers' blood must be sacrificed. But forced to decide whether to vote in parliaments, where there were parliamentary representatives, every single party of the Second International folded. So the SPD representatives voted in the German parliament to support war credits, which was basically funding for Germany to go to war. The French comrades did the same, and the British. Only the tiny Serbian group and the Russian Social Democrats continued to argue against the war. So faced with this concrete choice about where to vote on a pressing question of your nation going to war, each of these parties voted to support their own imperialist government going to war against the workers of other countries. So on the 3rd of August, the SPD papers wrote, "For our people and its peace, much if not everything is at stake in the event of the victory of Russian despotism. Our task is to ward off danger, to safeguarding the culture and the independence of our own country. We do not leave the fatherland in the lurch in the hour of danger." So basically just a complete capitulation from going to talking about international strike towards against the war, workers of the world unite, to we've got to support Germany against Russian despotism. And the same was going on all across Europe. World War I would go on to kill and injure 40 million people. It was a global industrial war. The short war that was promised at the beginning soon ground into a stalemate, and capital and the state machine became fused as they poured 50% of Europe's working class men into the meat grinder to fight against each other to the death. We need a lot more. There's so much politics and understanding actually what happened in the war, and I'm not going to be able to talk about that, but it's important backdrop. Not only was the First World War ended by workers' revolutions, but the period after the war ushered one of the highest points of workers' organisation. The Russian Revolution, but also revolution in Germany, workers' councils in Italy, Hungary, even in Australia, which hopefully if we have time I'll get to. There was a general strike known as the New South Wales strike, general strike of 1917. So, incredible period, probably the highest period of working class upsurge followed the First World War. And British Prime Minister Lloyd George wrote of the period, "The whole existing order in its political, social and economic aspects is questioned by the masses from one end of Europe to the other." So that's kind of how it ended. But for socialists, the capitulation and dissolution of the Second International meant the start of the war was an experience of abject isolation and desperation. Rosa Luxemburg, who was a true revolutionary, who had been a leader in this million-strong SPD, she and a handful of comrades who continued to oppose the war sat around in a room and literally contemplated suicide together. Lenin had seen himself as an ally of Kautsky until 1914, to the point where when he read the reports in the newspaper about the SPD representatives voting for war credits, he literally thought it was a forgery. He just could not believe that the socialist parties had capitulated to this degree. Only 14 of the 92 parliamentarians in the SPD had argued to oppose war credits at an internal meeting, but they all voted together for it. What this would have meant if they had voted against the war would have pushed the SPD into illegality and threatened all the infrastructure and the relationship to the German state, which I'll go on to talk about as quite key. Instead, they became part of the war apparatus. The Kaiser actually consulted SPD members and trade unions about the running of the war, and they agreed to the banning of strikes. So, complete pull to the right, abject capitulation with imperialism. So just to explain how, first of all, I think the SPD was really seen as the legacy of Marx and Engels, and Kautsky quoted Marx continually. But in effect, the reality was that the SPD, the war exposed the nature of the party, it didn't change it. And the truth was that the SPD was in reality a reformist organisation with a kind of revolutionary wing. The rhetoric was Marxist, but underneath the actual actions of the party were increasingly reformist. And to understand this, think about the economic rise of German capitalism, which is precisely what necessitated the drive to the First World War. It had seen the mass expansion of the German working class and its organisation. So, for instance, in 1899, there were only 108 full-time union officials. But by 1914, there were 2,867. Similarly, in 1893, 11.6% of the SPD parliamentarians were union officials. By 1912, it was 32, so nearly a third came from the trade union bureaucracy. And this is really important because union officials occupy a distinct role in capitalism. They've got a distinct political outlook. Their lives aren't dictated by the capacity to win wages at work. They're protected from layoffs, and their entire livelihood comes from their role in state-sanctioned negotiation between workers and bosses. The infrastructure of the union means more to the union officials for their livelihood than the success of the strike. Unions in Germany, this is also quite distinct from Australia, which we'll hopefully get to. Unions in Germany grew alongside the growth of Marxism, which is, I think, one of the reasons why this whole capitulation is so dramatic after 1875. So the rhetoric of Marxism had a big weight on the actual growth of the union movement inside Germany and on their development. But on the other side, the reality of this incredible bureaucracy, both in the trade unions and in the party itself, it relied on legality, it was about slow growth inside parliamentary elections, and it was about negotiations that were auspiced by the German state. So there was this, growth of a bureaucracy which had a Marxist rhetoric, but in reality was about a negotiation that relied on the nature of the German state. And when it came to choosing, they backed the German war effort. So this revealed their reformism rather than created it. So just to talk a bit about the politics of this, Rosa Luxemburg had argued that Bernstein's revisionist argument, so he had been a theoretician in the SPD who had sort of argued that, because prior to the war, there was a period of kind of capitalist boom, and Bernstein had said capitalism has resolved its crises. It's now, a growing, stable system with no war and no economic crisis, and we can move slowly to the socialisation of the economy. And Luxemburg just smashed this out of the water, but she argued that his politics represented the role of the trade union bureaucracy, of this kind of gradualism and sort of trying to whitewash the nature of the German state. Kautsky he was happy to win formal votes inside the SPD and kind of overlook the reality on the ground that the party was increasingly dominated by the trade union bureaucracy. So one example was, in one year, the SPD Trade Union Conference voted that it was absolutely not going to talk about the potential of a mass strike. The same year, the party voted that the mass strike was the policy. And the way that they rectified this situation was to take a vote to say that these things were not in contradiction. So it was like, Kautsky was very happy as long as he was winning the votes in the Congress and there was still a kind of clear Marxist line. He was happy to not actually look at the reality of what was going on the ground. Luxemburg very, very clearly articulated that, the debates that were going on between revolution and reform were not just different tactics towards the same goal of socialism. Actually, they were completely different strategies. One supporting capitalism and the other actually leading to revolutionary socialism. Unfortunately, as we know, her organisational conclusion was that the way to uproot this trade union bureaucracy was that the struggles, as she saw in 1905, mass struggle would brush aside the trade union bureaucracy, and revolution, the party would continue to be a revolutionary party of the masses. And unfortunately, she was very, very wrong about that. I just think it's interesting because, I won't maybe say that later, but Kautsky, he pulled out these very literal things in Marxism, some of which were definitely mistakes in Marx and Engels. Marx and Engels didn't deal with organised reformism, but, they had really stressed working class unity, which we do as well when we talk about the importance of things like the importance of unity and struggle, etc. But he took that as the unity of the party is sacrosanct. We need to keep all of these very different kind of components together. And, for instance, Marx and Engels, Marx had been polemicising against the anarchists about reforms. They'd said, we don't need to worry about reforms, we just, do all of these insurrectionary stuff. He said, no, reforms, fighting the day-to-day struggle with workers is part of building a revolutionary alternative. Kautsky took that and said, reforms, Marx says reforms are very, very important. That's why all of these reforms and gradualism towards socialism are very important. On the other hand, Marx and Engels had criticised the German, their critique of the Gotha program was about the fact that the German SPD didn't make clear the need to smash the state, and they had this kind of blurring of the potential for, the capitalist state to grow over to a socialist state, and they had already criticised that. But Kautsky's Marxism was basically a cover for this kind of reformism, but with lots of very grandiose kind of long-term, like we're going to have a global strike to stop the war, the glorious socialist revolution that's coming, or this sort of very general talk to cover the reality of the reformism of the party on the ground, and very, very distinct to Lenin's Marxism, which was always about the way that the revolutionary politics is embodied in every single dispute and, the nature of practice, the practice day to day. So when 1914 happened, Lenin, up until 1914, Lenin had looked to Kautsky and he could not believe what he was seeing. So this forced Lenin to go completely back to the drawing board. And the work that he did in the face of this capitulation of the Second International is basically a revitalisation of revolutionary Marxism that brings us the politics that we have today. So I think it's worth sort of saying some of the Kautsky things that he was arguing against. Kautsky had tried to use some of Marx's phrases about war to say that, the correct approach was that there was a country that provoked war and a country that was its victim, which in other words meant whoever started it is the baddie and Germany's fine. This wasn't Marx and Engels, or it wasn't their position after 1870, but crashed. Lenin's theory of imperialism just smashes this out of the water. He explains that the war is not an accidental thing, and every single belligerent imperialist power is centrally involved. So, he talks about the war as a result of the current dynamic of capitalist expansion. The characteristic feature of the period is the final partition of the globe. Now only redivision is possible through violence. We're already 15 minutes. Okay. The war is being waged for world hegemony, fresh oppression of weak nations, another division of the world, colonies, spheres of influence. The old robber powers of Britain, France and Russia would give up their share of booty to Germany, a younger and stronger robber power. This was... we all sort of know Lenin's theory of imperialism. I think it's useful to kind of think of it in the context of these debates around the war and of socialists talking about, a strategy for peace and things like that, which I won't be able to go into. Lenin's theory of imperialism. So, basically that the only way to end the war, the logic of the war was such that the only way out of it would be to foment civil war, revolution inside societies, and by actually throwing off our own rulers and offering solidarity to workers of other countries, that's the only way we can undo this logic, and that was proved absolutely right. The second thing that Lenin did was to talk about his theory of reformism and his theory of the Revolutionary Party. So he went back to State and Revolution, he went back to Marx's writings about the Paris Commune and repudiated all the kind of gradualism of the Second International to reassert the place of insurrection in the working class revolution. He also, he hadn't understood that the break between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks wasn't just a tactical, solution to the illegality of the Russian circumstances, but was actually a fundamental thing for all socialist parties, a break between reformism and genuine revolutionary organisations. That every country needs its own sort of revolutionary organisation, so he articulated that. One thing I did want to talk about is that Lenin's actual understanding of the material basis for reformism was quite wrong. He had this theory of the labour aristocracy where he saw a privileged layer, both union bureaucrats but also highly skilled workers in the imperialist countries. He had this theory that they had increased wages and conditions, not as a result of the struggles that they waged, which is what we say, but because they had sort of benefited off the imperialist super profits, the colonial exploitation, the exploitation of the colonial world, and this layer was open to nationalism. It was just a really, really bad take on reformism, and it was proved wrong in the course of the First World War in a couple of ways. Firstly, the revolutionary upsurge 1917 to 24, it was actually the engineers who were a very privileged, skilled layer who were the vanguard of the revolution in places like Berlin, Glasgow, Turin. They formed a lot of the communist parties. They were skilled, and that meant in this sort of industrial machine of war, they weren't sent to the front. They were able to hang on to their workers' organisation, but it made them, the leadership of revolutionary struggles. So it was proved wrong in the sense of that. But I think another really important point was that you look at Russia itself after 1917, a situation where you go from complete repression and illegality to a revolutionary situation where there's suddenly dual power, and there's a massive story about that I should have already told. But what happens? Actually, you get the rise of a Russian variant of reformism. The Bolsheviks only represented 1 out of 16 people in the Petrograd Soviets. So these are workers elected directly to Soviets, and yet the majority followed the social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks and were basically reformist. Now, where does this come from? that sort of organic reformism, which is a product of the situation of workers under capitalism, where they're still looking to someone else, that this sort of the bourgeois parliament or these Soviet leaders are going to, make the difference for them. And the history of the Russian Revolution is the Bolsheviks' capacity to win those reformist supporters inside the revolutionary working class in Russia over to the Bolshevik position throughout the course of 1917. But I think it exposes again, the fact that the labour aristocracy theory doesn't hold up. So I think just this maybe need to be the conclusion. Lenin's call for stopping the war through, this sort of rhetorical voluntarist call to strike to stop the war was not Lenin's method, but he looked to the real balance of forces. And what that meant was to muster resistance against the war at the beginning of the war, when it was very unpopular to be anti-war in a lot of situations, but to muster that resistance, including theoretical clarity, including waging the ideological fight against the Second International Marxism and all of its mouthpieces. And these theories, his theory of imperialism, the party of the state, were tried and proved by the experience of the Bolsheviks during the war. I've got a whole potted history of the Russian Revolution of how the ideas actually played out. But I guess, in October, when the Bolsheviks come to power, they publish the secret treaties that all of the belligerent countries were trying to do with each other. And they unilaterally withdraw from the war. And the theory is, we're pulling out of this imperialist war, and we call on the workers in Germany and other countries to do the same. And that actually worked. There were uprisings in Germany. The war effort started to collapse under the influence of this, and the Kaiser abdicates, and we see the end of the First World War. So Lenin was right, but I think that at the heart of it, the reformism that we see in the SPD, continues with us today. And I think those fundamental things about the way that the, reformist parties are tied to the state means that in periods of imperialism, like we're in today, and in periods of war, it pulls the leadership of the reformist organisations way to the right to, anti-strike clauses, supporting sending millions of people to their death, supporting all kinds of barbaric things. At the same time, the base of reformism, the people who vote Labour, the people who look to those organisations, can become increasingly radicalised by the experience of the war. And I guess the job of us as revolutionaries is how to start to win Labour's support base, the people who vote and look to Labour, away for them in the face of, this absolute, slavering determination to be part of America's war effort in the universities and across the US bases, etc. It's not a global war at the moment, but we can see the beginnings of that. And I think the potential to use this politics to understand that Labour's leadership is going to go to the right, but there's a base of reformist workers who we can win through, through sort of sound approaches is the lesson.